Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, YouTube. I just did something I would not recommend you ever doing. I read through the entire book of Judges in one day. Now, this was a couple days ago. I didn't just read through it today, even though it's very late in the day. I've been going over it in my head, and now I wouldn't recommend reading a entire book of the Bible, much less the Old Testament, and even less than that, the book of Judges in one day. This book is not a nice one. Like it's only 21 chapters. It's not a giant book, but it's a hard book to read. There's a lot of stories in the Bible that just make you, I don't know what the term would be for it. Like it's just they're hard to digest. They're because this book starts out hopeful. It starts out, pretty much in the end of Joshua and all of chapter 24. God's telling them how he actually verse 23 it starts at. Now 23 and 24, and right at the end of the book of Joshua. I'm very bad when it comes to academically expanding on things. Um, Chapter 23. Did I say verse before? Man, I am out of it today. Chapter 23 and 24 in Joshua, God's pretty much just re-going over everything that he did for the Israelites, and how none of it was by their own hand, that all of it was purely God's power, that he was bringing them into their land. And then the book of Judges starts. Joshua dies, and then it just goes down the tubes. it the first thing they do is the very first battle they're in, they decide not to destroy all the inhabitants of the places. And it says, with all of them, neither did Ephraim drive the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer out. Neither did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kirhan. Neither did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Atru. Neither did Naphtali. I'm mispronouncing these names, by the way. None of these people, like not people, but none of the tribes drove out the civilizations they were taking over. But instead, they decided, hey, we can have these people as tributes to us. We can have these people giving us money, giving us supplies, just we can use them for our benefit. And then in chapter 2, it says, the angel of the Lord, which if, depending on how much you like to study stuff in the Bible, like the angel of the Lord always refers to God's commandments as my commandments, as I said. Like, for instance, in chapter 2 here, it says, the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my commandment with you. And, he goes saying, you have not obeyed my voice. Wherefore I have said, I will not drive them out. And it's just, if you look at the whole view of the Trinity of, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, where the angel of the Lord is God in the Old Testament, and you can see all the times he comes down. He's, people say, Jesus isn't in the Old Testament, but if you actually read the Old Testament, Jesus is everywhere. He's been there from the beginning, and he's there all the way to the end. And but pretty much what happens is, he comes down and saying, you done goofed. You didn't do what I told you to do, so I'm not going to be with you. The entire book is just Israel going further and further downhill and just into more and more wickedness. And every time they forsake God, and then he goes back and he brings them back up. He raises up a judge to fix all of the problems that they caused themselves. But even the judges that start being raised up later and later on into the book, they keep getting worse and worse. Like their methods, the way they're acting, their moralities. It's a very hard book to get through, because the amount of pain, the amount of just the amount of wickedness, the amount of torture, the amount of rape, the amount of murders, the adulteries, everything that is contained in this book is just it's a very brutal book to read. Some people say the God of the Old Testament is so much different than the God of the New Testament. Like, you look at God in the Old Testament, and he's a very angry God. He kills everybody. And then you look at the God of the New Testament, and Jesus is saying peace and love to all mankind. If you actually look at it, the amount of stuff God does in person in the Old Testament, the amount of times, literally, the angel of the Lord comes down, where God appears in person to people, where God sends prophets, he gives his direct word, people see fire come down from the sky, they see miracles before their faces, they're fed in the wilderness, the amount of stuff that God does in person and the amount of stuff he keeps doing, and yet they keep turning away from him. It's the whole thing of, if they didn't follow God with the amount of stuff they were shown here, they will never follow him. If you live through these events and you see all the stuff God does for you and you still don't believe in him, you will never believe in him. The book seems to show, from a very quick glance, the wrath of God, him destroying, just every time people turn away from him, absolutely destroying them. If you read it enough, you'll notice that the book is just filled with God's mercy. Every single time they turn away from God, he destroys the people. But every time that the people turn back to God, he has mercy on them and he frees them. Every single time. The thing that is so heavy about this book is that the people never learn. They always keep, like, no matter what God does, no matter how much mercy God has, people keep turning. And then, by the end of the book, the people stray so far from God. You have a man who's just referred to as a Levite with his wife, who ends up becoming a whore, and then she ends up getting thrown out of a house to be raped. And then she dies, and he cuts her in 12 pieces and sends her to the 12 tribes of Israel. The stories that happen later on in this book are horrifying. And the things that, what this book shows is the absolute depravity of man's heart and what we do when we run from God. And it's hard to read. It's not an easy book to read at all. And it keeps going back to the saying, in those days there was no king in Israel. And then it'll say it again, in those days there was no king in Israel. In those days there was no king in Israel. The stories in this book are not easy to read. They're not nice things. They're not fairy tales. You don't read these to your children. You definitely don't read the Old Testament to children. But it's the truth of what happens when we run from God. It's the truth. It's what you're seeing in America nowadays. It's what you're seeing all across the world nowadays. People are running from God. They're running to their own lusts and their own idols, their own desires. And there is just so much wickedness. I mean, there's no other term for it. It's absolute wickedness. You have just the amount of violence, the amount of sex, the amount of just crime, the amount of this book is, while yes, it's a very hard book to read, it's important, because this book shows exactly what happens to a civilization when they turn from God. And it shows the path that America's down right now. It shows the path that a lot of countries are down right now. And I bring up America and, the U.S. a lot because that's where I live. But it can be applied to any country. When you turn away from God's principles, when we refuse to follow God's laws, and we refuse to live our lives in the way that God had created us to, this is what happens. It's not nice, but it's important that we know what happens. Like, it's important. It's history. It's the whole thing of, if you don't know history, those who don't read history are doomed to repeat it, or those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And the book of Judges finally ends. It says, again, in those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. And you see that so much in the world nowadays. Everything is around self-love. You have so many things about self-love and self-improvement and self, and do what makes your soul thrive, and do what you want, and be free, and just, everything's become so selfish. And when that happens, everything breaks down, because people become lovers of themselves. And we shouldn't be surprised when God's not blessing the country. And when you have thousands of children being murdered every day by abortions. And when you have the amount of sex trafficking going on, the amount of rape, the amount of murders, the amount of adulteries, the amount of divorce, just everything going on is all a result from us turning from God, a result from us unwilling to just get on our knees. While, like I said at the beginning, I don't recommend reading this book in one day, at the same time, I almost do recommend reading it in one day, because it's a lot to take in. It shows what happens when you turn from God, but it also proves time and time again what will happen if you turn back to God. And if you turn back to God, he has mercy. It says, it's right near the beginning of the book. It says in chapter 2, verse 13, "And they forsook the Lord, and served Baal and Ashtaroth." I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce the name. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of spoilers that spoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so that they could not any longer stand before their enemies. Wheresoever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn unto them, and they were greatly distressed. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers had walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge, and delivered them out of the hands of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented the Lord because of their groanings, by reason of them that had oppressed them and vexed them. And it came to pass when the judge was dead, that they returned, and corrupted themselves more than their fathers, in following other gods to serve them, and to bow down unto them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. And repeatedly, that's what they do again and again in this book. God said he would not hearken unto their voice if they turned from him. And God keeps his promises. But when they call back to him, he delivered a judge. Every time the people came back, every single time, he came back to them. And I know I keep going over the same thing. I've pretty much just been saying the same thing for the last, I don't know how many minutes this video has been. It's not a complicated book. It keeps saying the same thing over and over again. But it's an important thing to learn because that's exactly what happens in our own lives. God will never leave us if we call on him. It does not matter how many times you've sinned again. It does not matter how many times you failed at what you're trying to do. It doesn't matter how many times you've gone back to your old ways. God will always forgive you. That's not a free pass to do whatever you want. It's not a way you can just say, oh, God's going to forgive me for everything I do, so I can just sin and then I'll just ask for forgiveness later. God looks at your heart. You can't fool God. Don't fool yourself by thinking you can fool God. It's a promise to those who actually care and still have a problem with their sin, because we live in a fallen world. We have fallen bodies. We're not going to be perfect. But what the book of Judges shows is that God is a judge. But as a judge will judge people for evil and deliver them to their punishment, a judge also will set people free. And God is the ultimate judge, and he will set you free. You have to genuinely call on him and want to be free. And until we do that, until countries do that, he will not heal our lands. I can't remember what verse it is. I'll pop it up on the screen. It says, and if my people will hearken unto my voice, I will heal their lands. That's what some people can miss, I think, where everyone's saying, oh, God bless America, and God bless all these countries. But if we don't turn back to him, why would he? When you really think about it, that God would be breaking his promise. Do you want God to break his promise? Do you want God to bless evil? Do you want God to bless abortions? Do you want God to bless murder? Do you want God to bless the rape? Do you want God to bless all of this? No, I understand a lot of times people will say, God bless America, because it's the people that they want him to bless. It's the people who are following his word. But in the promises of God show that he will bless people, but we have to turn back to him first. God is always there wanting us to come back. He doesn't abandon you completely. It's not like when you're sinning, God just abandons you. God will not let your life get destroyed past the point you need to repent. He will only let it get so bad that you come to repentance to him. To some people, that is worse than others. Some people need more to turn back. Some people need to be reprimanded more before they finally learn their lesson. But God will not obliterate you, because God is a loving father and he loves you. When you're trying to train a child, you don't always bless them when they're doing something not evil, but when they're doing something wrong. You correct them. You correct your child. In the same way God corrects us. And it may seem brutal sometimes, but God knows the absolute wickedness in all of our hearts. And he knows what we need to turn back to him. And he'll give that to us. Some people he knows a lot more needs to be done in their lives before they'll turn back to him. Other people, they don't need that much prodding. And now with this, I'm not saying that problems in your life are showing you're turned away from God. Like we're never promised a perfect life. I'm not saying that if your life's hard, it's because you have to turn back from God and that you're sinning some way. It's not that. God's punishment on people is not up to us to decide. Like for us to say that God's punishment is too harsh or his punishment isn't harsh enough, we have no right. I mean, when you really think about it, we have absolutely no right to tell God that. And that's what, I guess that's what the book of Judges proves. It's just God will judge people how he sees fit for their sins because God is a judge. And God will also forgive people how he sees fit. And it's not on us to decide how he does that. And it should never be on us. I mean, it's not something that we've been given or should be given ever. I don't know if you caught the last couple seconds of my ramble on the previous video. Literally, I was talking and I said, and I think I'm about done with what I'm saying. Like, I think I'm about ready to wrap up the video. And right then I look at my camera and it says change the battery pack and it stopped recording. So I don't know exactly where at the end of the video it cut off. But I just kept going in circles and repeating my last point again and again. So I think this is a message to me to stop talking, to stop recording my video. So, Lord willingly, I'll see you all later.